Well, I'm going to refer to you as Paul because I've seen you in shorts. Thanks for being here with us, Paul. So just the simple basic question is why write this thing? You've done a lot of work in very technical metaphysics on universals and properties, but how has this switch to more cultural or public-facing philosophy happened for you, and how did this book play into that?
Yeah, good. So I do actually view this as a work in public philosophy. If we think about, you're right, there's academic work that is primarily for the academic discipline, and that's a lot of the sort of technical metaphysics work that I'm interested in. But of course, there's all these questions related to culture, and especially this question, how does the gospel get a fair hearing, that has really driven me for the last couple decades, actually. And so a couple years ago, I wrote a book called Cultural Apologetics, and that was written for Christians wrestling with that question, how does the gospel get a fair hearing? And in there, I basically argued in a more prescriptive and hopeful part of the book that we can join with God and each other to re-enchant the world. And part of what I argued for there was two things. Number one, that we would learn as Christians to see and delight in the world the way Jesus does. And then number two, that we would learn to invite others to see and delight in the world the way Jesus does. And those are two future book projects, of which the second one is this book. So this book, A Good and True Story, is trying to help others, those who are not yet believers, those who are non-believers, to see and delight in the world and to notice the world the way that Jesus does, so that they could see that there's actually a God behind it all, and that Christianity is the true story of the world.
That's really wonderful and a big task. So there seems to be a logical progression in the book just from looking at the table of contents: universe, life, species, humans, morality, meaning, happiness, pain, love, beauty, and religion. Can you talk to us about how you see that logical progression?
Yeah, so I actually have three, theses or things that I'm thinking about that inform the way that I shape the book. And one is a thesis about reality itself. Many, especially in the Christian story, they've noticed this pattern of wander and return, or exodus, redditus in the Latin, to speak with the learned, right, guys? And so the idea is that everything comes from God, and that everything one day will return to God, and God will renew all things, and we receive them as humans. And so there's this idea that reality is a kind of ongoing story. And so that is what I'm tapping into, is this idea that reality is an ongoing story of which we take up our place, and in that we find our identity. So the first thesis is a thesis about reality, and that's how I've structured the book in terms of origin, quest, and destiny. And then there's a thesis about human persons, and that's the idea that we too come into the world with this sense that reality is a story, and that we're seeking our place in that story, and that we have this sense that if we discover the true story of the world, we discover our identity and our meaning and our purpose. So that's a thesis there. And then the third sort of idea was a thesis about evidence. And it's actually from Stephen Evans, who I know you studied with, Brandon, in his book, Theism and the Natural Science, or Knowledge of God. And in there he talks about how the evidence for God is widely available. It's just everywhere, right? Everywhere you look, there's evidence for God. But it's also easily resistible. And so the point is that it needs to be interpreted. And so what I wanted to do is take the reader on a journey of discovery and help them to interpret rightly the evidence, or at least what I've come to conclude is the right way to understand the evidence, to see it as evidence that points to ultimately Christianity as the true story of the world. So those are kind of the theses that inform the posture and the way that I wrote the book.
In terms of the evidence that you address, you could think of it with the design argument, for example, that there's very technical evidence. But then you also might think, too, that just based on being a human person and the way that you describe it, that there is a more intimate kind of evidence, and then one that sort of naturally seeps through culture that people might not even be directly aware of. Can you talk a little bit about those three kinds?
Yeah, I do think that that's actually one way to think about the structure of the book as well, right? So the first couple chapters, I'm looking at the four origin debates: the origin of the universe, the origin of life, the origin of species, the origin of humans. And that's going from effect to cause, or from fact to explanation, right? So it's kind of a backward thing. Here are these features of the world, life, universe, species, humans, and they cry out for explanation. So that's going from effect or fact to an explanation or a ground or a cause of that fact. But then as the book progresses, from the origin debates, I begin to look a little bit more at the contours of the human heart. you know, what's going on there. And so explore chapters on meaning and morality and happiness. And there it goes the other direction. We begin with features about the world, and then we ask, what is the story that's the best fit with these certain features that we find in the human condition? So, for example, on the meaning chapter, you know, I called it this existential set. There's these desires that each of us have for an identity, for value, for purpose, for like intelligibility, for transcendence. And so if these are sort of features of the human heart, what is the story that fits best with that? And I kind of canvass all the different stories on the meaning of life and argue that there is, you know, a supernatural story that fits best. So yeah, there is that kind of interplay, one from effect to explanation, and the other from these deep longings of the heart to what is the best fit in the world. And in both cases, I think that you see that Christianity is the story that we long for, and of course the objectively true story of the world as well.
That's great, I love that. So there seems to be two things, and I guess I'll ask one first, is there seems to be this kind of presumption or direct seeing of realism, that there are actually objective facts about the world. But then this sort of trust that God actually speaks to people through those things. And you might think that the way that standard apologetics is often done is that you've got to really convince people that are not seeing the evidence so much, and you've got to put it in front of them. But this approach seems to be, the world is out there, it's real and discoverable, and God's actually speaking through that. Can you talk a bit about how that approach differs a bit?
Yeah, so I mentioned earlier that I wrote this earlier book, Cultural Apologetics, which was written for Christians about how we ought to, or at least in my view, how we ought to engage culture. And part of that was that we need to treat humans as fully embodied humans, right? We're not just sort of minds on a stick or brains on a stick, but we have emotions, we have desires, we have wills, we have a moral conscience, we have the imagination, and so we want to treat humans as humans and use all of the epistemic resources that we have in building the case for Christianity and showing that it's true and good and beautiful as well. And so in this book, A Good and True Story, it's not a book about cultural apologetics. In my view, it's a book of cultural apologetics, where I try to basically do the things that I argued we should do. And so what I do then is I try to take the reader on a journey. And in fact, the central metaphor of the book, as you can see on the front cover, these cairns here, in the idea of, you know, when you hike, you have these cairns that guide you to the summit. And that's the kind of central metaphor of the book. There are these clues all over the place that God has put into our world, right? And each of these clues is a pointer, a sign to something beyond this world. And so we're looking at each of the clues, the rocks, but we're also stacking them one on top of the other. And in a way, they kind of act as guides, as cairns, to reach the summit of the thing. And so, yeah, I do think that God has placed evidence everywhere, and that God is seeking, revealing himself, right, through this evidence.
So you're one of the guides on the path. God's also guiding.
Yeah, and yeah, I think so. And also, I do invite, other guides. And these include, like, so for example, in the first 4 chapters on the origins, Lady Nature is our guide. And what's so interesting in doing research for the book, I noticed in a lot of medieval travelogues, there would be Lady Nature, the personification of nature, that would be in these medieval travelogues. And so we invited her, show us the empirical evidence, right? You know, what are the clues, and how do they reveal deep truth about the world? And then a little later in the book, Lady Philosophy. We actually, Boethius, through the constellation of philosophy, Boethius was personified a discussion with Lady Philosophy, and so she joins us explicitly. She's actually with us from day one, from the first chapter, but she joins us. And then there's other guides, you know, whether it's skeptics, so Hume and Voltaire, and others make appearances, as well as Lewis and Pascal and Aquinas and Augustine and those like that. So yeah, all these people are guides that are helping us. And of course, I think within that, though, there's the Spirit of God that is guiding us as well. So
That's wonderful. And I take it like one of the really beautiful features of the book is that you're moving from early historical sources all the way through, which seems to sort of tell a story of humanity's been working at the same problem over and over and over. They're recalcitrant. They won't go away. And there are brilliant people that have been wrestling with this all the way up until now. That tells a wonderful story. I like the idea, too, of having different guides that are helping you along the way. Your chapter on human persons was brilliant. What philosopher of mind really influenced you in that chapter?
Yeah, I don't know. This guy Brandon? No. Yeah, no, so there I'm just interacting with, and I know you know this, but interacting with some of the typical dialectic that takes place. What is the best explanation for the origin of minds, for conscious minds? And so I do interact with Dennett, actually, Daniel Dennett, who's a contemporary, as you know, Brandon, a contemporary philosopher of mind who actually thinks that consciousness is an illusion. And so if naturalism is true, there are no actual conscious minds. So interact a little with him as a foil, but there we're just exploring the question, what explains consciousness? What explains these features of our mental life, such as intentionality, the aboutness or the ofness of our thoughts? And again, I think these are clues, right, that cry out for explanation. And the question always is, well, what's the best explanation? And that's one of the nice things about writing the book this way, is like with the guides and on the idea of a quest or a journey to discover the true story of the world, is I can just sort of present the evidence the best that I understand it. And it's not my decision, right? It's the reader's decision to come to the conclusions that they can. And so our job, I think, as Christians, as philosophers, as public-facing philosophers, is just to do the best we can to communicate the truths that we've discovered in a way that they can understand and in a way that's compelling. And so that's what I'm trying to do in that chapter and in the book in general.
That's great. I know that you like Marilyn Robinson. She thinks, she states consciousness is the most important issue in our culture, and she wants to go beyond just the neuroscience and the philosophy of mind into the issues that you're talking about, meaning in culture. Can you tell us a little bit about that story? How you move from what persons are, philosophy of mind and consciousness, to meaning of life, and how that's expressed in culture?
Yeah. So what was kind of fun is do the 4 origin debates and explored those in the book, and then we arrive at the chapter on morality, and this is where we take a turn. I began that with Boethius, because Boethius was, a 5th century scholar who found himself unjustly put in prison, and he's basically lamenting, I had this perfect life, this happy life, and now everything is gone, and what was true happiness? And then so Lady Philosophy appears to him, and they begin to have this dialogue, and she basically says, you understood the origin of your lives. Can you not understand your destiny, right? You have lost the path of truth. And her job is to put him back on the path of reason. And so we begin with Boethius in prison, questioning, is there meaningful happiness to be had? And so there's the chapters from morality to meaning to meaningful happiness that kind of are this sort of unit. And so with the meaning chapter, though, the idea is that we all have these deep longings for an intelligible story that makes sense of and helps us understand our place in the cosmos and helps us discover our true name. And so there I just kind of catalog, there's been a lot of discussion in the philosophical literature on the meaning of life, and so I catalog some of that into 4 stories. There's what I call absurdism, which is a version of nihilism that interact there with Sartre and his book Nausea. And the idea there is that there's no meaning, and so life is absurd, and there is no fit between that existential set and the way the world is. And kind of explore that a little bit, argue that that's just not the best view. And then I actually look at this other version of nihilism that I call nice nihilism. And there I'm actually riffing on Alex Rosenberg, who in his book, An Atheist Guide to Reality, Alex Rosenberg is a philosophy professor at Duke University. And in that book, he calls his version of morality in an atheist universe nice nihilism. And I think that's actually an appropriate term for this meaning nihilism that many millennials and Gen Zers have actually embraced today. And you can look in the literature on this. A lot of millennials and Gen Zers are saying, look, God doesn't exist. All right, let's go party, And so this kind of nice nihilism, let's live it up. And so I kind of explored that as a kind of nihilism, and if that has, actually satisfies the deep longings of the heart. From there, I catalog a view that I call enchanted naturalism. And this is actually by Rosenberg's colleague, Owen Flanagan. And he wrote a book called The Really Hard Problem. I know you're a philosopher of mind. You know what the hard problem is, how to make sense of a mind in the material world. But Flanagan says the really hard problem is locating meaning in a materialistic world. And so I interact with his book. His is a kind of enchanted naturalism. He actually thinks there is a kind of subjective landscape, or even an objective landscape of truth and goodness and beauty. And I kind of consider that and ask, is that really a good fit? Does that explain the deep longings of our heart? And I argue that it doesn't, partly because the ending of the story on naturalism infects all the deep longings of the heart and whether or not we actually find satisfaction and identity and purpose. And then finally, the fourth story is what I call enchanted naturalism, and that's the idea that there is not just deep goodness, truth, and beauty in the world, but a God behind it all and the source of it all. And look at Lewis and Pascal, who had some wonderful things to say about that. But yeah, I think the idea is that we're creatures who are seeking meaning, right? Intelligibility to our lives. And even the fact that we seek intelligibility to our life, I think betrays the intuition that there is coherence to the universe at rock bottom. So
Wonderful. So we're coming out of a pretty significant cultural moment with COVID in particular. And you've got this thesis about enchantment, which is the world is a particular way, but it's not seen that way. And you've got these three initial models about what could be or isn't a meaningful life. And then this last enchanted supernaturalism, which is just there. So we know that the world is supernaturally enchanted, but out of the previous three, which do you think we're at linked with coming out of COVID?
in many ways, probably nice nihilism or maybe the enchanted naturalism, but I probably want to lean more towards the nice nihilist. I think that there is a significant portion, and again, you can look on the internet. There's been a lot of articles written about this. Gen Z millennials that are saying things like, "There's no meaning in life, but I'm going to get my 15 minutes of fame," and so they do like the Tide. What is it, the Tide Pod Challenge, or like, have a celebrity run me over with a truck. Like literally they're asking for these things so they can have their 15 minutes of fame or things like that. And you see a lot of that's going on, I think, in culture. And there's the idea that, at least given disenchantment and given the secularizing forces, there's one strand of culture that is bought into that, and so they're just going to try to grab as much as they can out of that. And so like for Rosenberg, the nice nihilist, what he says is, look, if you can't handle this world, right, the fact that there is no actual meaning in the world, well then take drugs, right? And for him, those drugs are usually Paxil or anti-anxiety drugs. But I think for the Gen Zers and the millennials are like, well, forget that, let's go get the good stuff, right? And that's the kind of, I think, mindset that's pretty prevalent, at least in that generation. But I'm sure that I think for a large part of people, we have this intuition that there is some deep value and goodness and truth and beauty in the world. And so in that sense, even if God doesn't exist, I think we have this sense that there's objectively valuable things in the world. And so we just need to press on and say, well, does that really fit with your naturalism? Is that a tight fit? And that's the kind of direction that I go in the book.
That's great. So you've got this thesis that says there's no meaning to life, and so let's go party. Right. But then you've got this thesis which is, no, the reality is enchanted by Christ and his kingdom, and so let's go party. Now, at that party, will you let me stand in front of your car and run me over?
If that's what you want, bro, we got it.
I've got like 3 minutes of fame. I need another 12.
That's right. Yeah. I'll help you with that.
Thank you. You're always giving. I love that. So what I find interesting is just how personal it is that authors show up in their work. And so I'm curious, what was the process of writing this for you personally, spiritually, intellectually, but just as a person, a fully embodied person? And then how do you see yourself showing up in the book?
Yeah, this is in many ways a very personal book. In fact, by the last chapter on religion, I become the guide, primarily the guide, and just share my own journey to faith in Christ as part of that story. But in teaching and in writing, I am of the conviction that students learn well if they know you as a person, right? You don't just want to be a talking head. And so in the same way in the classroom, that is how I prefer to write anyhow to this audience, is to share just my life, my journey, my thoughts. And so yeah, our kids show up, their personal stories show up, dumb things that I've done show up, good things that I've done show up. All that shows up, I think, in the story. And hopefully those things are relatable, such that people will be able to understand and relate to it better. In terms of how this shaped and changed me, I think it just gives me an opportunity to reflect on, so for example, 2 chapters that were really enjoyable to write, this book gave me an opportunity to think more deeply on, were the chapters on love and the chapter on beauty. The chapter on love, specifically, I was just captured by this quote by Joseph Pieper. I think that's how you say his name, is a Catholic theologian and philosopher, where he says the fundamental affirmation when you say I love you is the fundamental affirmation is that I'm glad that you exist, right? And that's just such a provocative thing. I'm glad that you are. So that was fun to explore this. There's all these contemporary views on love, as you might guess, and to kind of walk through the different contemporary views and then see where they are lacking and they don't sort of cover the phenomena of love, this affirmation, this central affirmation that I'm glad that you exist. But then you find in Aquinas, right, this 13th century celibate monk, right, that he got it right. Love is these two desires, union with the beloved and the well-being of the beloved, right? And so just interacting with this concept of love and thinking about my own family, my own friends, my experiences in life, that was a lot of fun. And then on the beauty chapter, what was neat is that there actually hasn't been a lot of recent discussion on the argument from beauty to God. There was like an early 19th century F.R. Tennant did some work on the argument from beautiful things to God. And then there's been some contemporary discussions of the argument from beauty, but they usually are just saying, hey, like the moral argument, we can give an argument from beauty, and it's very similar in form. But this gave me an opportunity to really dig into the phenomena of beauty and notice some features about beauty that are unique to beauty as opposed to like morality, that cry out for explanation. So I was able to formulate an argument that I think is sort of novel, sort of interesting with respect to beauty. And so I really enjoyed, in my own journey, just making connections. And one thing that was really cool about that was one piece of evidence about beauty that's a little distinct than like the evidence from morality is that beauty is, the world is saturated with beauty, right? Everywhere you look, from the heavens and the stars to the microscopic to everything in between, you see beauty everywhere, right? And that would be surprising on naturalism, because in the same way that in art, it's difficult to create beauty. It's easy to create art that's not beautiful, right? But it takes a real skill and talent to bring about beautiful things. You wouldn't expect in a naturalistic world for beauty to saturate every aspect of reality. And to me, that's a fact that's quite persuasive for a divine artist. And so those two chapters in particular, I really enjoyed just thinking about those things.
Good, so let's talk about that a little bit more then. So you wouldn't expect on naturalism for beauty to saturate the world. Is that because there's no evolutionary advantage to beauty in the world? What's your argument?
No, so that is the typical reply, is that beauty is, like most things on the neo-Darwinian explanation, have some sort of advantage for survival. But this is slightly different. So the intuition is that, or I should say the example or the analogy is this. Just as for the human artist, it takes a special skill to bring about a beautiful piece of art, right? Like I'm trying to learn to write right now, actually. I'm trying to learn to draw, I should say. And my first drawing was not beautiful, right? But, it's an attempt to bring something out that has the kind of qualities that are beautiful. And so it takes a certain skill. And so if naturalism is true and the world just comes about by natural processes that are blind and there's no sort of agental cause behind that, you wouldn't expect the world to have these features, this beauty all around. But in fact, what we find is in fact that, saturated. Everywhere you look, you find beauty. So I think that's what's going on there, is you wouldn't expect that on naturalism, so it's surprising. But it's not surprising if the world is the product of a divine artist. So the other piece of evidence that's kind of cool there was, and this is a language I use, but beauty has this transcendent quality to it, right? And many thinkers, from Plato all the way to contemporary thinkers, have noticed that beauty sort of cries out or suggests something infinite or eternal or permanent. And theists and atheists have noticed this feature about beauty. And again, this is a feature that cries out for explanation and would be sort of surprising on naturalism. Like, why would beauty have this transcendent quality, this evocative nature, if there is, in fact, nothing that it's pointing toward, right? And so I kind of interacted with that feature of beauty a little bit and was surprising to see that this feature does seem to be something that most people have acknowledged, and it does seem to have this feature. And again, that's suggestive. Yeah.
That's great. So you wouldn't expect the world to be as beautiful it is on naturalism. But of course, there are things in the world that also probably don't seem to be beautiful. And in the book, you mentioned me twice. One, why do you hate me so much? But secondly, more seriously, how then do you deal with but these things look really horrible?
Yeah. So I do think, so I have a whole chapter on pain and evil and suffering. And there is an analogous, in the argument from beauty, there's an analogous argument, the problem of the ugly, right? It's similar to the problem of evil. There's actually kind of they're parallel arguments. And again, and actually you can give parallel replies in these cases, but I do think it's important in any book where you're just seeking to discover the true story of the world, you have to address pain, and you have to address suffering, and you have to address the ugly and the broken and the van shoes and things like that, right? No, these are wonderful. The socks. Yeah, and so I think that what's so interesting, though, in exploring the question of pain and evil and suffering and ugliness, I do think ultimately Christianity has the most satisfying answer to this. And Peter Kraft, I think, has taught me well in this. You know, you can, as philosophers, we have sort of standard replies that we give to the problem of evil that show that it's not improbable that God exists given the amount and the distribution and the horror of evil and ugliness. But that's at the level of mere theism. But what Christianity offers you is not just a propositional answer to the problem of evil, but like a personal answer. And that person is Christ on a cross, right? And he takes all the sin, all the ugliness, all the evil, all the suffering, all the pain upon himself on the cross. And to me, that's God's answer to the problem of pain and ugliness. And that, to me, is the most satisfying of all the possible answers on there. And that's why I think Christianity alone can handle the problem of pain and ugliness and ultimately defeat it.
Do you see beauty also in the cross?
I do, yeah. I mean, in many ways, this is the most horrific act or event, but also the most beautiful event, such that, you know, the incarnate Son of God takes on all the pain and evil and suffering on our behalf, right? And so I love what Plantinga would say in this. He wrote his little essay, O Felix Culpa, you know, O Happy Fall, where he says the best possible story, you know, not just the greatest story, but the greatest possible story are all stories that involve incarnation and atonement, right? The cross. Because this is something that's incredibly beautiful, God saving, taking our place for the penalty for our sin, such that we can't do it on our own half.
That's really wonderful. So one last sort of philosophical question, and then I want to finish with something that's, you know, more personal. There seems to be this cultural shift where we want to be able to, we're not relativists anymore about what's evil. Well, their racial injustices are evil. There's no choice about that. But there seems to be a relativism about beauty. Mm-hmm. Or you might even think a skepticism about whether you could even know really whether or not something is beautiful. It's just beauty's in the eye of the beholder. We see things as beautiful, but they're not really beautiful. But your thesis is, no, things actually are beautiful. Mm-hmm. So how do you get people even interested in thinking that it could be known that the world is beautiful in and of itself?
Yeah. Good. So, I mean, there's two routes for this. I do argue, you're right, that beauty is objective. Like in the same way that there are physical facts about this podium and those shoes, there's moral facts, right? There's moral facts in the universe. Honesty is a virtue. Rape is wrong. Murder is wrong. In the same way that there are physical facts and moral facts, I do argue that there are aesthetic facts, right? That sunsets here in Florida are objectively beautiful. That the Rocky Mountains are beautiful. That act of mercy on the cross was objectively beautiful, you know, and so on. And so I do argue, and you can argue for that, and I do in the book in a number of ways. Sometimes you can just argue indirectly by showing the falsity of aesthetic subjectivism, right? You can kind of go that route, and I do that a little bit in the book. But in many ways, you can just see, I think, by the dint of reason, that there's objectively beautiful things in the world, right? And in fact, Peter Forrest, who was someone that's been rehabilitating the argument from beauty, he has this little wonderful quote that I quote in my book, where he says, he's kind of discussing with an interlocutor, and the interlocutor is saying something like, look at that sunset, so ugly, and look at the mountains, you know, nothing, not sublime at all, you know, and he's kind of mocking it. Why? Because we can just see by the light of reason that these things are beautiful things, right? And I think that there's something to be said. C.S. Lewis argues this way about morality, right? We can just see the truth by the dint of reason itself that we ought to love our neighbor, and that's objectively a fact about reality. And I think in the same way we can see that there's objective beauty. But you know, to go back to the arguments for it, one thing that I discuss in the book that is super provocative is many philosophers have noticed this connection between beauty and truth. It's a tight connection between beauty and truth. So just to give you one example, in science and in philosophy, when we do theory evaluation, we often ask of our mature theories, do they have certain theoretical virtues? because the theoretical virtues are thought to be truth indicative, right? So what's so interesting about the theoretical virtues, all of them are aesthetic properties. Do they have elegance? Do they have simplicity? Do they have explanatory scope? These are aesthetic properties. And so what's interesting, we can't even evaluate our theories as true or false without aesthetic considerations. And so that's kind of an interesting, Ed Zimak actually wrote a whole book defending the objectivity of beauty, and he talks about this in one of his chapters, and I found that super persuasive, this connection between beauty and truth that many have noticed.
That's wonderful. So you see this objective fact and the sort of propositional arguments, but then this idea of you've got to get people in front of things that are beautiful. And this reflects your thesis about us being fully embodied humans. So what aspect of the book do you use to get people to sort of put the book down and go experience things that are beautiful?
Yeah, I mean, in some ways, I think that in telling the book as a story, as a quest, in which I blend reason and the imagination, art and stories and culture and movies and things like that, and personal stories. In doing that, I'm hoping to keep it grounded in reality, right? Because as you know, as philosophers, we're very comfortable with syllogisms, and we're very comfortable keeping our fingers out of the ground, out of the soil. And so in trying to write a book, even with the metaphor of a journey, of a hike, of a quest, I'm trying to keep it sort of embodied. I'm trying to keep it at the level of our lives. And so I guess in that sense, what I hope to do is to never remove the reader from the reality that they live. I'm just helping them through my own experience and the story of the book to make connections to their own journey in that way. So yeah, hopefully the idea is that we never left for the airy world of the Platonic realm of syllogisms, of which we give arguments, but I try to keep them embodied in that way.
That's great. So that leads me into my last question then, is that as authors, we're writing for an audience. Yeah. And so for the people watching, who is this book for? Who did you write this book for?
Right, so this is written for non-believers, but I do think Christians would benefit from it. I think there's lots that I benefited from just studying and writing the book. But it's primarily written for non-believers who are on a quest, and I think we all are on a quest to discover the true story of the world. And even more specific than that, I wrote it for like the normal college age kind of, so high school to college age student, 20-something student, although again, I think that anybody could benefit for it. But that was sort of who I had in mind when I wrote this.
That's great. So thank you for painting that really wonderful picture and bringing us through the story, as you said, and making us want to sort of jump in and read along that story with you.